Hello, this is Aaron Wren, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Farah Stockman, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, who is a member of the New York Times editorial board. And for the purposes of our conversation today, the author of the wonderful book, American Made: What Happens to People When Work Disappears. Thank you so much for joining me, Farah. Can you hold the book up and let people
Oh,
see that,
sure.
by the way? It's
Yeah,
got
here
it's
we
got a
are.
great cover. If you're a reader of my newsletter, then you know that I had put this on a list of 17 books that I just recommended that people read. And this was in the section about how to get a picture of America today, like what's going on in America today. And this book is great at doing that. It is the story of a bearing plant in Indianapolis from a company called Rexnord that moved to Mexico, and the lives of the people who are affected by that, who work in the plant. And again, it's a great story. How did you come across this story in the first place?
Aha. Well, it was right after the election in 2016, and a lot of people at the New York Times were shocked by Trump's win. I tell a story in the book about being at Wellesley College. I was one of many people dispatched around the country to kind of uh, gather string for the historic milestone of the first female president of the United States. And of
Hmm.
course, the night ends in a shock and disaster for the people at Wellesley College, Hillary Clinton's alma mater. And so that was the beginning of like, okay, something big was missed here. What are we missing? And my sister, I actually grew up in Michigan, so I grew up around a lot of people who had worked in factories. And when you ask people, or when I asked people at that time, I heard a lot about factories. I heard, Trump's going to bring our jobs back. He's going to bring the factories back. And my sister she's actually an engineer who designs robots. And she posted something on Facebook that was in response to the people who were saying, forget it, those jobs are never coming back, get over it. And she said, you can at least have empathy for these people. And she designs robots that replace people. But she said, she obviously felt like, at least I'm doing something that's going to keep the factory here on US soil. Um, I know I'm designing some machines that might replace a few people, but at least it's going to keep the operation here. And so when she reported that, I said, let me go out and find a factory and really see what it's like to be replaced. In this case, by workers in Mexico. And the New York Times had set up kind of like a fault lines team. It was a team to go out and look at the fault lines that were dividing the United States. And this was the story I pitched, like, let's find a plant that's going to let me in. And like, they didn't actually let me in. The company didn't actually let me in, but the workers really let me into their lives in a way that I, could have never imagined. So I spent the 4 years of the Trump administration really following these workers who had, first I followed their lives as the plant was taken apart, as their machines were shipped to Mexico. And then I looked at what happened to them next, just to see, like, how does that change your worldview when you're told, oh, your job's gone because those people over there are going to do it cheaper.
Yeah, right after the election, but even before Trump took office, there were two big publicity things that happened in Indianapolis.
Yeah,
One was
yeah,
when Carrier said they're moving to plant to Mexico, and Trump made a big deal out of that.
yeah.
And then Rexnord did the same. And you reported on both of those at the time. It seems to me that the Carrier plant actually got more press at the
Oh, yeah.
time. What was more compelling about the Rexnord story that made you decide to follow those workers instead of the Carrier workers?
Well, so Carrier was Trump's. he would mention Carrier at all these rallies,
Right.
and he would say like, how many of you are from Carrier?
Mm,
And they would, like, people in the crowd would raise their hands, and then he'd say like, how many years of seniority did you have? And they'd call out their years of seniority, like, 10 years, 15 years. So Carrier was really this thing that he had been doing for months. And so after I think it was right around Thanksgiving, after the election, he went to Carrier and made a big show of saying, we're going to save this plant. He organized with I feel like it was the governor and different powers that be, and they negotiated a deal to save this one plant. And so that was a moment in my book. Carrier's union was actually the same union that represented the Rexnord workers. It was right down the street. And so there was a lot of hope at Rexnord that Trump would save them too. And I can't tell you how many hours the workers like spent between them outside on their smoke breaks being like, he said no more in a tweet, no more. Like,
mm,
does that mean no more that our plant is going to be saved? Or does that mean like no more after us? And they
mhm,
really, I mean, it really gets at the personal connection that people felt with Trump. Like when he tweeted about Rexnord and tweeted no more, they felt he personally knew of
mm,
them, of their existence, that he cared about them. And so that's one of the reasons I was like, I really want to know what happens if this plant does, if he's not able to save this plant, right?
mhm,
What happens? And the other thing that happened at the time was that the union leader, Chuck Jones, became sort of a folk hero on the left for calling out Trump's, um, I guess, fuzzy numbers on the number of jobs saved.
mm,
I think there was, I can't remember the exact details, but he claimed to have saved many more jobs than were actually saved. And and Chuck Jones, called his BS out on CNN, and within, I don't know, an hour, Chuck Jones's phone was buzzing because the president-elect
mm,
had attacked him on Twitter and was saying what it was like, the union's done a terrible job representing people, and no wonder companies are fleeing, and
mm,
reduce dues, less talk. He really went after Chuck Jones, and I thought, I wasn't much of a labor reporter at that
mhm,
point, and I thought, like, how is this president-elect trying to appeal to blue-collar workers by going after this union leader? What is going on here? So I really wanted to understand the backstory with Chuck Jones and how this was playing. And it like, that union hall was like, international press descended
mm,
on it and camped out there for months. There was a Japanese film crew literally living in that union hall for weeks at a time. It was driving people crazy, but they knew they wanted the media attention. It was a crazy circus, and I ended up just really wanting to get inside and to stay after that story, to really see what happened after all the cameras left, and who those people really were. And it took me years. I
mm,
followed them for 4 years, and I feel like I didn't catch everything, but I really got a sense of what was meaningful to them and what those jobs meant, and why they were doing the things they were doing.
mm. Well, you're fortunate that the Times supported you in doing that. And continuing to report it reported for the paper for an extended period of time, then of course did the book.
Yeah, I mean, I did a 7-month story about Shannon, that ran in the paper on the front page. Shannon was a woman, single mother, domestic violence survivor. She was the main character of the book, but also of this first article that I did in the Times. And she was an unlikely hero you usually think of these, union guys, white men in these factories, feeling entitled to jobs. that were paying more per hour than anybody else around in Indianapolis was making. But Shannon was a different kind of character. She was somebody that liberals in the East Coast could relate to. She was,
Mm,
you know, this was around Me Too movement and all that stuff. She was the kind of person you would have thought would have voted for Hillary Clinton. Um, you know, she didn't call herself a feminist, but she was a blue collar feminist. She was somebody who had escaped an abusive relationship by getting this job in the factory. And she worked her way up from janitor all the way to heat treat operator, which was like, it was like the equivalent of being a samurai
mm,
warrior. Like they worked with explosive gases. It was deadly. Like it, you know, if she messed up her job, everybody's life was on the line.
mhm,
And when she first tried to be trained, when she started to be trained for that job, the men didn't think it was a woman's job, and they did everything and anything to try to get her to quit. They played all kinds of pranks on her, and she wouldn't quit because she was making $25 an hour, and it was more money than she'd ever made in her life. And so she, you know, she mastered that job by hook or by crook. She flirted with them.
mm,
She did whatever it took, and she ended up getting trained. And she was, by the time I met her, she was in charge of that department, and they needed her. She was literally one of the last workers in that plant because no one else knew how to run those machines.
mm. Yeah, Shannon Mulcahy was one of the three people that you really follow
Yeah.
throughout the book. And again, it gets to this idea, you know, the stereotype of these union workers in a manufacturing plant is, you know, it's a white guy who's married and has like a vacation home out in the country with his little fishing boat. I mean, it's not a nice house. It's
Right.
not like,
Right.
you know, the kind of vacation homes people have in the Hamptons,
Yeah.
you know, but he takes a couple of vacations a year. Uh, but, you know, Shannon and these other, you know, as we see the other people, they'd been through a lot before they ever got to Rexnord. I mean, she
Yes.
grew up in, I think, Mars Hill, which is a very tough neighborhood in Indianapolis, which is maybe a unique city in having a lot of poor and hardscrabble white neighborhoods in
Yes.
it as well. You know, she had a child very young. I couldn't quite calculate the age. She suffered from abuse. She has a son with schizophrenia. She ends up caring for a disabled a granddaughter, I think it was just
Yeah.
extremely disabled, permanently disabled. And
Yeah.
this is somebody who's starting off in life with a ton of sort of strikes against her
Yes.
on it. You
Yeah.
know, and I think for a lot of people, it's like this Rexnord job was, and for I think for a lot of people in the plant, this was sort of like the dream job for them.
Totally.
It wasn't like something they expected. You know, my dad worked for GM, so now I'll get to work for GM. It's like these are people who'd been through a lot, and this was almost a culmination of building something towards the American dream.
Yeah. I mean, it was not easy to get the job, although you did have to have a relative or friend
Hmm.
working in the plant. It's almost like the job was the most important thing you could inherit from your parents
Mm.
or your uncle. Her uncle had gotten a job in that plant, and so he ended up getting her hired. It wasn't that easy, but she made it work. Every single one of my characters had an inside person who helped them get on. And once you did, it was, she felt so proud of that job. She would run into people she went to high school with in Mars Hill, and they'd be like, "Where are you working at?" And she'd say, "I'm at Rexnord." And,
Mm.
she called it Link Belt because that's the old name of the plant. And she would just watch the envy on their faces
Hmm.
because they were so good to their workers. And there were so many programs to help you. And, it does show the strength of the union, what kind of benefits they had. That it was just, there was this idea that if you got fired from Rexnord, you wouldn't, there was nowhere that you could work because they gave you so many different chances. They gave you alcohol treatment if you were an alcoholic. There were all these, They had a 401k plan. There were remnants of the old way, of the old paternalistic way that the factory would take care of you. And they often talked about the factory as a family, um, it was a shock to them when it closed, and it was a shock to many of them. I will say that I did detect racial differences because there were a lot of Black workers in that plant. It was a very interracial plant.
It was almost like 40% Black or something, right?
Yes, much more diverse than any newsroom I've ever worked in. And that was another surprise to me. It was like, here we are often demonizing blue collar workers for bigotry, but they lived much more interracial lives in Indianapolis than many white collar people I know. And I'm not saying it was all kumbaya, rainbows and unicorns, but it was real. I mean, they went to Colts games together. There were several interracial relationships on the factory floor. There was a camaraderie among some of them, and they were in the same union. They fought for each other's jobs in a way. But when the plant started closing, and this announcement that was going to close, and then they started bringing these Mexican workers up from Mexico into the plant to be trained on people's machines, and then as soon as they were trained, the machines would go away and you'd be laid off. It was like pandemonium. It was like something broke in the plant, and it was like a little microcosm of America, of what was going on in America, because a lot of the white workers, it was like they couldn't handle it. They didn't. They had the strongest union members were the ones whose fathers and grandfathers had worked there, and so this was inconceivable, and they wanted to really raise hell. A lot of the Black workers that I talked to felt differently. They felt like, okay, if you want to train you're going to refuse to train the Mexicans. Well, that sounds like racism to me. By the way, you all in the union didn't want to train my daddy. You all in the union didn't want to train my uncle. So they had a very different, attitude. And it's also, I think they had, many of them had done other things. One had been in the Marines. That a lot of the Black men that I was following inside the plant had different experiences, and they didn't consider themselves steelworker as their first identity. And so, it was ironic because they statistically would have a much harder time finding a new job. But Wally, who was the Black man I followed for years after the plant closed, he had the most optimistic attitude of anyone in the plant that I could find. He was like, I met him at a union rally, and he gave this fiery speech like, we got to stand and fight for our jobs. And he was, talking about interracial solidarity and the need for it. Really gave this tough speech. And I came up to him afterwards like, hey, I'm this reporter, and can you talk to me? And all that fire was gone. And he said, yeah, me personally, I'm going to start a barbecue. I'm going to start my, and he just gave me a business card. And I was like, who is this guy?
Yeah. One of the people that you follow, this guy, John Feltner, he had previously worked at, I think, Navistar, that had, which was another big union operation that had closed. And he sort of comes in with a little bit of the paranoid expectation that the same thing was going to happen again at Rexnord.
Yeah.
Which, again, it seems paranoid, but his prognostications prove very accurate.
Yes.
And when this plant closes, it had already begun against the backdrop of these union plants have been closing. And, we've seen it happening in the Midwest for so long. Were the people that worked there, did they really not think it could happen to them? Or like, how did that background of all these other jobs leaving, how did that affect them?
I mean, I think they knew. I mean, they had seen plants close, but I think when you live in a plant, or when your livelihood is this plant, there are rumors every year. that go around about plants closing. And so I think they just kind of learned to turn off the rumors, just to focus on their jobs. But it was really a death spiral. I mean, once NAFTA happened, right? So in the 90s, you had NAFTA, and sort of, which opened the floodgates, made it much easier for plants to move to Mexico. Then you had this sort of place where even the ones that remained had to bargain away the benefits because
Mm.
of fear of closing. So every time they came up for a contract, it wasn't like, what are we going to ask for this time? It was like, what are we going to protect and what are we going to sacrifice, giving
Hmm.
up their pensions or healthcare or whatever, in order to just keep trying to save the plan. And they'd been in that sort of mode for years. So the tiny clique of guys, including Chuck Jones, who ran that plant, ran the union at that plant, they were all older and they were kind of trying to get to their retirement age where they would get a really nice pension. John was younger. John was,
Hmm.
and he'd just gotten to the plant, so he didn't have that much seniority. So he was looking at getting paid out like, I don't know, a couple of weeks of pay per year.
Hmm.
And he'd only been there a few years. So
Yeah.
it was, he was in a different situation than the others. And he was very militant, and he gave me a totally different perspective um, on white workers, white blue collar workers. This guy was the grandson of coal miners.
Mm.
And I went to Hazard, Kentucky to kind of research his people, and they were militant, extremely militant. And, so for him, when he hears the term white privilege, it angers him because he's like, nobody gave us a middle class life because we were white. We fought for that. And some of us died. He had the sort of institutional or familial memory of these wars that the coal company fought with workers. His grandfather's mine had fought a literal war in the 60s
Oh yeah.
in Hazard, Kentucky. They blew up the workers during a strike. They blew up a coal tipple so that scabs couldn't come in and load coal onto the trains. And the company retaliated by planting a bomb under the union leader's house. And his wife and child had to be evacuated. And this whole thing ended up with a worker named Ernest Creech crossing the picket line and saying, enough, we've been striking for months. I have 7 kids and they're
Mm.
hungry. I'm going back to work. And he was killed. The union killed
Yeah.
him. And so that was where John's father was graduating from high school that year. And his dad just said, get out of here, get out of
Hmm.
Kentucky. There's no future. And so John's dad went to Indianapolis with his young bride from high school, and they showed up in Indianapolis, and there were plenty of jobs out of the coal mines. This is the modern world, all these factories, right?
Hmm.
And his father gave him one piece of advice. John's father gave him one piece of advice, which was never cross a picket line.
Hmm.
That was the only like employment advice his father ever gave him. And so he had this really militant history. He was not your average Republican voter. He had not been a Republican. He'd always been a Democrat. He'd always told his kids, like, when Democrats are in office, old dad has a job, right? This old union way of thinking about things. But NAFTA completely scrambled that. He ended up, he voted for Bill Clinton. He liked Bill Clinton. But then all the factories started closing, and he blamed Bill Clinton big time for that. And he wasn't the only one. His friend Tim has a very similar history.
Hmm.
Both of them had come from these long line of union guys in mines and then car plants, and then and both of them saw jobs leaving under NAFTA. They both blamed Bill Clinton. And by 2008, they're trying, okay, maybe we'll take a chance on Obama, who says he's going to renegotiate NAFTA. But when he doesn't,
Yeah.
they are wide open to Trump's message.
Well, it's interesting. Again, the stereotype would be these factory voters are all big Trump supporters, But in fact, it's not like this is an all Trump, plant by any means.
No.
They seem to be, you know, there's some Trump supporters, but there's a lot of people who don't like him. There's people who are very cynical.
I mean, they were all cynical. Let's be
Yeah,
honest. All of them were, crooks. They're all crooks. Politicians are all crooks. That's the main thing that was the main message that I heard. But Trump was a crook that was speaking their language and talking to them, and he was the first to say to them, "You deserve your job because you're an American."
Mhm.
Right? It was
Mhm.
the first time I kind of understood like what the power of the America First message. Like people kept being told like, well, we can't do anything about it. This is capitalism. It's cheaper to make this stuff in
Mhm.
Mexico and China. So that's where the jobs are going to go. Get over it. You're going to have to learn a new skill. And that's not what these people wanted to hear at
Right.
all. And it's one thing to tell someone that when they're 20s and 30s, when they're in their 20s and 30s. It's another thing to tell someone like that when they're 40 and 50 and they can't learn a new skill.
Right.
And also the seniority matters. I mean, these guys who had suffered from a plant closing already,
Yeah.
they were men who had really thought that by this time in their life they were going to be working, the day shift, and they
Mhm.
were going to be at the, they would have paid their dues, and now they're starting on the night shift. They never see their wives. They literally never sleep
Mhm.
with their wives because their wife works during the day and they work during the night, and they might see each other for an hour, if that.
Right.
It actually upends your life, and then your wife becomes the breadwinner, and you're no longer living up to the lifestyle that your father-in-law
Mhm.
gave his family.
Mhm.
And so there was a sense of loss of and just of just that the family was upside down.
Mhm.
And it was something I had not considered. I don't think a lot until you look really closely at their lives and how their lives actually work, that you see like I get the disappointment. I get the feeling of betrayal. You were told if you did all the things your dad did or your father-in-law did, you'd make it. And now, no, you can't make it with a high school degree anymore.
Right.
And even the ones who worked hard to send their kids to college, their kids weren't always making it.
Right.
Even going to Purdue, going to a college that's going to get your kid in debt and not necessarily deliver a middle class job.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Especially if they don't finish, which becomes a huge problem, for people, who come
And
from those backgrounds is you get
right,
in and you can't finish.
how can you finish if you're working full time to pay the bills?
Right.
Yeah.
Mention that like people don't really understand the reality of the lives of folks like this. One of the points you make with regards to Shannon is sort of about the feminist movement and how most of its concerns and priorities are things that are mostly to the benefit or the priority of highly educated professional women and don't necessarily, serve the needs of someone like Shannon, who's, a, single
Yeah.
mom, single grandparent, disabled kid, works in a factory. What, in your view, would be a more Shannon friendly or blue collar friendly feminism, or what kind of policies do you think would be better to be focused on there?
Affordable childcare.
Hmm.
I mean, childcare is really important to working women, and there's not enough of childcare that people can afford. I think paid family leave.
Hmm.
I mean, the United States is one of the few industrialized countries that doesn't have like universal maternity leave policies. Like if you have a baby,
Hmm.
in other countries, even quite poor countries, if you have a baby, you get time off. In the
Hmm.
United States, I got some time off, but I don't think blue collar workers get the kind of family time off, family leave time off that they need. And I do think Hillary Clinton had some policies that would have helped Shannon, but she never heard about them. She didn't know about them. And to her, Hillary Clinton was not a speaking in a blue collar language, something that she was a low information voter. She didn't have time. She worked 12-hour shifts. She didn't have time to read the paper. I think probably the first time she ever held the New York Times in her hand was when she was on the front page of it. So for her, she would have needed. I mean, I think that's what one of the reasons Trump gets these kind of low information voters to come out and vote for him is that he just speaks in a language they understand. And even the Stormy Daniels stuff. I remember Shannon talking about Stormy Daniels, and she was like, she's out to get another woman's man. I knew a woman like that, someone who was coming after my man when this stripper, down at the club was always after my man, trying to get the food that should be on my table.
Yeah.
And
well, they actually know strippers. I mean, these people don't. It's not just something that other people do. It's like they actually know strippers. I mean, probably a lot of strippers living in Mars Hill. It's a sketch area. I mean, like,
she definitely equated Stormy Daniels with some woman she knew who had gone after her man and successfully taken him away from her. She was not gonna consider Stormy Daniels a feminist icon, right? And I also think that the family lives of these workers were all complicated. Shannon had 2 kids by 2 different men and was with the third man. And it complicates just, she can't just up and move out of the state when she has a lot of this complications, personal complications. But it also changes the way they view what's going on in the White House, right? I mean, Obama's perfect family was like a complete and total anomaly in Mars Hill. Like, who loves their wife like that? Who's still with their baby mama? Both of them. Like, I mean, I think that was John Feltner was of the 3 I followed. He was the one who was married and had the stable marriage that was really what carried him through the closing of the plant, through the closing of 2 plants, actually. And his wife was very resourceful. She was amazing, holding down her job, following the kids. And, Wally and Shannon were both single parenting teenage boys while working the night shift. Their boys were out making mischief because they weren't home and they didn't have another parent who was home taking care of kids. And so it was a very practical reason why this life where you're single parenting and have very odd hours, your kids are going to be up to no good. And I remember looking at John, and he obviously, his situation turned out the best, you could argue. And I was like, I don't know if that's because he's the white man or if it's because he's the one who remained married. And both,
losing your job increases your risk of divorce by 30% if you're a man. And so the fact that, his marriage did not collapse, I think was key. I was thinking is, I mean, if his wife had left him, there's a guy I think is probably going to end up as a fentanyl overdose. Very good chance of that.
I mean, he certainly would. He certainly would have had more challenges. I mean, that family was extraordinary in that their kids were working to pay the mortgage. Their kids worked several jobs to pay the mortgage, and their oldest son, instead of going to college, went to work to help them keep their house. I mean, they ended up losing it the first time the first plant went down. They lost their house, they lost everything, but they didn't lose their family. And I think that in this country, we don't have a social safety net like Europeans do, but marriage becomes that social safety net. And so what do you do when,
Hmm.
that institution itself becomes not the norm among these blue collar families? And I think you can see big differences in people who go to college, how long they stay, how many get married, and how long they stay married, um, versus people with just a high school education. There's huge differences there. So I came away from this whole experience thinking that class and education is a huge part of the gap, the political divide in this country, and people who make the decisions, even if they have the best interests at heart of the blue collar people that they think they're working for, they don't understand their lives well enough to
Hmm.
actually know how their policies are going to impact them. I think that's frequently the case.
Yeah. We didn't talk much about Wally yet. I want to because he's
Yeah.
the one I want to dig into because I know you really had a special affinity for him, and he's really this guy. He had a heart of gold. In a way. Tell us about Wally.
Yeah, so Wally was loved by everyone. Men, women, black, white,
Mm.
union, management,
Mm.
everybody loved Wally. He was um, the the son of sharecroppers. I'll say the grandson of sharecroppers. His people came up from Georgia to work in the plants. His dad actually went to Purdue and became an engineer, but worked as a sort of a supervisor in a factory, and didn't want Wally to end up in a factory. Wally was the most solidly middle class of them all in his upbringing. His dad was a very serious Christian. They sent him back to Georgia every summer to be with
Hmm.
the grandparents and stay out of trouble. Paid
Did
for
his uncle own a company too? Something like that? Was that Christian?
They all had side jobs.
Yeah.
They
Okay.
all worked in factories, but had side hustles, running, real estate, buying and fixing up houses, that
Hmm.
sort of thing. Because again, they didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket. They didn't want to be, too dependent on any one employer. Wally's uncle had actually been the first black foreman at that Rexnord plant. And I mean, just like Shannon told me about blue collar feminism, like Wally's family story told me how much of the civil rights movement was about uh, black men being able to operate machines on the factory floor.
Hmm.
Because at the time, at that plant, all the black men were janitors.
Hmm.
And Wally's uncle in the 60s got a job in that plant, but he was made to be a janitor. And he used to get on the union steward's case and say, I pay the same union dues as they do, but I
Hmm.
earn half the money they make because I don't I don't get to operate a machine. I went to technical school. Don't you know I can operate a machine?
Hmm.
And the union steward looked at him and said, "Oh, we know you can operate a machine. Of course you can. Of course you can. But it's just there's only so many jobs in this building. And if you get one of those jobs, that's one less job for his son or
Hmm.
my, son-in-law." And so it was really a stark example of the white union leaders keeping those jobs for their own people and not sharing those jobs with the black workers that were coming in. And so the day that the Civil Rights Act passed, Wally's uncle went to his boss and said, I want to operate a machine. And he was given a machine on the factory floor that day.
Hmm.
But his coworker wouldn't train him. He had to learn from afar by watching, and it took him much longer. So you saw all the obstacles that Wally's uncle went under to become what he was at that factory. It was much, he didn't have the same camaraderie. Nobody was going out of their way to help him. Similar to Shannon, right?
Hmm.
Shannon, they didn't want to train her either because heat treat is not for a woman.
Hmm.
Um, By the time Wally came up, his uncle had become such a legend at that plant and was so respected that Wally got a job right away,
Mhm.
just on the strength of his uncle's reputation. But Wally had kind of gone off the rails in his teenage years. He'd gotten a girl pregnant in high school and then decided to move out of his house and support his pregnant girlfriend um, by selling drugs. So
Mhm.
he had a long detour into incarceration. And when he came out, this job was basically the difference between, are you going to have to do a job that's going to endanger your life every single day, or a job that's going to give you a 401k? And,
Mhm.
so the Wally's story really showed what access to a good paying factory job could do for you, and do for a guy like that. There were a number of men, not just black men, but also one of the most famous murderers in Mars Hill
Mhm.
was working in that plant.
No, wow.
And had gotten a job there. This was a place of second chances. It was a place where you could start over again and become a new person, a steel worker,
Mhm.
somebody respected.
Mm.
And that's what they lost. That's what they lost when the factory closed.
One of the things that struck me about Wally's story, you mentioned his dream of opening a barbecue
Yeah.
place. And you see this in his family. And this is a pattern that I see a lot when I see writing about sort of black middle class or black neighborhoods, is when you open the Times, like a lot of the talk is about racism and reparations and things of that nature, and not that these people are deny that that sort of thing is a reality, but they're real. They want to they want to be entrepreneurs. They're not looking to just get somebody to send them a big check. He's looking to, like, I want to create a business. My dream is to be a business owner, and maybe to too great an extent don't realize that you actually need capital. Like, if Wally didn't have the capital, if somebody had like given him the money, he might have been able to start a more successful business. You need outside expertise to help you learn it, but it almost seemed like so much self reliance, almost to a fault, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, Wally was such a fantastic window into this world because he had been able to amass cash as a drug dealer, and he
Mhm.
was putting that money into, first he put it into his girlfriend's hair salon
Mhm.
business. He bought her a hair salon, and it was ran as a successful business for a long time. And then he wanted to, he wasn't ever supposed to end up on the factory floor. His
Mhm.
parents had higher hopes for him. And so when the factory closed, he was like, this is God telling me I have to go start my own business.
Mhm.
His brother was a very successful. His brother's, I mean,
Yeah.
rich by many accounts, comparatively. Went to college and then started a business installing windows and doors. It is true that there's much more entrepreneurial spirit in the Black community than people understand or know about, because a lot of it is uh, it's off the books.
Mhm.
It's too hard to be on the books.
Mhm.
It's impossible to file all the paperwork that you're supposed to file, but
Mhm.
and still keep up. But a lot of these factory workers had side gigs and
Mhm.
successful side gigs doing stuff. I'm not saying that they wouldn't appreciate a reparations check. They sure
Yeah.
would.
Would
Uh,
help you start your business maybe if you had to get some startup capital.
Absolutely, absolutely. Credit, access to credit is another, it's another thing that people, it's very hard to get if you don't
Mhm.
have a job or
Mhm.
you don't have wealthy family members. Most businesses start with friends and family,
Right.
and if everybody is coming out asking you for money instead of
Right.
being willing to give you money for a business, you're at a huge disadvantage. But yeah, Wally had a huge aspiration, and he had talent. He was a hard worker. He was the hardest worker that anybody knew. Um, he just, because when he came out of prison, he said, "This is a second chance for me, and I'm grateful to have this job. I'm lucky to have this job." There was another guy who had been at the plant too, who didn't had never been incarcerated, and he walked around with the attitude of like, "Psst, Wally, you're working too hard. If you work this hard, they're gonna know that all of us can work that hard. You're gonna mess this place up.
Mhm.
Stop it." And they would time Wally as he was putting together these bearings, and he was a prolific bearing maker. And then they'd be like, "See, everybody, look at what Wally can do."
Mhm.
And it was like, they hated him. Like, there were a lot of people who hated him for being that hardworking, because it meant that they had to be that hardworking. So it's a complicated story. I mean, I think I also was able to talk to a big manager at that plant who said, "Look, I'm trying to save these jobs, and it's hard if the union is wanting." If 30% of your productivity goes into, people people just
Right.
not doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? People not actually giving their all. And so, maybe we could have saved more jobs if people had been doing what they were supposed to be doing. So it's not a simple story.
Yeah.
It's not a simple story. But at the end of the day, you really got the sense that there were these irresistible forces. Like the Mexican workers were paid $3 an hour,
Yeah.
and the Americans were paid 25. And there's no amount of smoke breaks that kind of really can account for
Right.
that pay difference. I went down to Monterey. I talked to the Mexican workers too, and a lot of them were so just disillusioned by the company when they saw they went to Indianapolis and they saw that company throwing their workers away.
Mhm.
Many of them didn't stay long.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I used to work in the technology space, and I think about when the rise of like Indian offshoring, and there's when you look at the cost differential, uh, it is something that like you certainly can't compete by being more efficient. There's just simply
Yeah.
no way to do it.
So that's the thing. How do you I think that's the challenge of our time, because it's not it's that's globalization, right?
Mm,
If you live in America, you're going to have certain costs.
mm,
You have to pay your rent, you have to drive a car, you need health insurance, right? You can't survive on $3 an hour.
right,
So what do you do? And now with AI,
right.
it's a whole, and so are we just going to consign a whole generation of people, more and more and more people, to no job or low wage service jobs that have no future?
Mm,
Um, is that where we're going? Is that what it's about?
yeah,
Or so I just think that we are we're facing this, and I'm not a Trump supporter. I think Trump is not a, a good
mm,
person, but I think I do give him credit for raising the question of the hollowing out of our industrial base, and whether or not we have to just sit by and let it happen. And I think Biden has not reversed the tariffs that Trump
no, he
put.
just raised the tariffs.
He just raised the tariffs, and so this is not this is something. Uh, this is bigger than Trump. This is
Yeah,
bigger than one politician or one party. It's something we got to get our heads around as Americans, and it's not just America. Like, all industrialized countries are dealing with this. Germany's losing jobs. Like, so, do we put up the walls? I don't want to do that either. But you got to give people jobs,
mm,
because if you don't give them jobs, their lives fall apart.
right.
And that is what I saw.
Do you have any thoughts on what an economic policy would look like? Are you?
Well, I mean, I I supported the CHIPS Act. I
Mm,
supported, there are massive investments going into reshoring, like critical technology.
mm,
And whether or not it's going to be a great big solution to jobs, I don't know, because there's a limit to how many people are going to work in those plants and what kind of people are going to work in those plants. But it's a start. around the time of COVID, when everybody got their American Rescue checks, I was wishing that they had asked for something in return.
Mm,
I was wishing that they had asked people to help contact trace or to leave food for the elderly or
mm,
just, even if it was something we couldn't tell if they'd done,
mm,
we have this tradition of not asking not asking that of people. And if you look back at what was so great about the response to the Great Depression, it was, people were given jobs, they were given something to do, and it
mm,
plugged them into a social network. You were taking oral histories, you were, painting murals, you were building trails. And it's something. A job is not just a paycheck, it's not just a way to feed yourself, it's actually a social situation. It's a union that gives you political voice, it's a place to be in the morning. And when I looked at, I was in touch with Shannon for years after she lost her job, and she was just adrift for a long time,
mm,
where she called up her old boss and said, like, will you still be my boss? Like, tell me what to do, I don't know what to
mm.
do. And I just think people are, they're not meant to be atoms floating in space by themselves. Like, we need a way to structure our lives. And until we, maybe we could build ourselves around volunteerism or something
Mm.
else. But let's not pretend that getting a check in the mail is a solution to the spiritual crisis that happens when you suddenly have nothing to do and no one to do it with. And that's what happens when a factory closes.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that Chuck Jones predicted within a year of the plant closing, at least one person in that plant would die, and it turned out
Yes.
three of them died, including Wally.
At least 3.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, spoiler alert.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
they died of,
it's
either, lack of health insurance, liver disease, overdose. There were a lot of deaths. And let's face it, this is the same population of people that are dying from opioids.
what
Same population of people that are getting incarcerated, dying in motorcycle accidents. John had a huge motorcycle accident right after
yeah.
the book came out. Um,
Yeah, again, that's why I say, like, I feel like when you think about the drug issues, I was thinking about that as this plant, is like when your whole life disintegrates and it's
yeah,
not obvious. Again, you're not going to get another $25 an hour job. There are no more $25 an
yeah,
hour jobs. Like,
yeah. The
and
other thing I would say, as far as uh, uh, policies, is healthcare. I mean,
mhm,
that was a something I didn't expect to see, but all three of the families that I followed ended up entangled with hospitals. Wally ended up in the hospital. Shannon's son ended up in the hospital. John worked in a hospital, and it's like, when we're moving to this place where you're in a gig economy or you have a crappy low wage service job, healthcare matters. And I think if we gave people, if people had healthcare, they could actually have the freedom to do different kinds of work. And I think that when you don't have healthcare, then you don't have drug treatment, you don't have, there's all
right,
kinds of things you don't have. So I wonder why we can't get a more bipartisan push around getting people health care, at least even if they don't have a job, they could have health care that would allow them to work in a more gig situation,
mhm.
and still make it and still survive. Um,
Yeah. I would also, before we wrap up, I'd be remiss if I did not mention that Chuck Jones was subsequently convicted in a
I was
corruption-related
I was
offense.
just gonna say
He
that.
is
I'm
a
waiting.
yeah,
I really do want to write
yeah.
about that.
He's a stalwart of the local kind of.
Yeah.
It seemed like a very petty thing, to be quite honest. Was more than anything else, but
Well, I have to say that there's something, you know, there was there was Trump's tweets about Chuck Jones in hindsight look more knowledgeable about the way that uh, the bottom workers see the union cliques, the cliques that run unions. And Chuck Jones was an insider guy who,
right.
you had to be on his team to get stuff. And
Mhm.
I don't know. That's the way that some people saw it. I haven't touched that, but I
Yeah.
kind of want to, because there is a resurgent union movement now. Sean Fain, I
Hmm.
think Sean Fain's the real deal. Like you're seeing a lot more union organizing than you did in 2017. And I still wonder what would have happened if they'd had a strike, if they,
Hmm.
maybe they just would have got nothing, which is
Mm.
what Chuck was saying would happen. But yes, I am to be continued on the Chuck Jones
Yeah. Yeah.
corruption trial.
Yeah. So, again, we're talking about the book American Made: What Happens to People When Work Disappears by Farah Stockman. There's a link to buy it in the show notes. I really think that this book does a great job of telling the human story and giving you a picture of what life is really like for people in blue collar work. Because, yeah, we talk about the theories of blue collar America a lot, but it's very different to see the realities of it. And I only have one more question. Most of my readers would fall into the category of people who probably aren't blue collar workers, aren't
Hmm.
necessarily like, it's probably a lot of listeners have college degrees. What is kind of the one takeaway you would want them to have? What is one thing you would like them to learn or be influenced by in reading this book?
Well, don't assume you know people's best interests.
Hmm.
I think there's this it's common in social circles that I run in to say, oh, why don't they vote their best interest? Why don't they vote their best interest? And wringing their hands. And there's some of that, but I think we know so little about the lives of these people that it's kind of hubris to believe that you know their best interests better than they do. If you believe in democracy, you have to believe that when they vote, there's something behind the vote, and we should take more care to try to understand what it is. And if there really isn't anything behind the vote, then we have to reconsider democracy itself, right? We have to reconsider the way that it's operating. Um, but I think, most of those people were not very politically engaged, and no one ever talked to them about their lives in a political way, except every 4 years when they came by the union plant to ask for their vote. And then they were, all too often disappeared. So I think we need to listen harder about how their lives work and what they're looking for. Um, but yeah, oftentimes what they're looking for is more time with family
Hmm.
and healthcare and
Yeah.
childcare, and similar to stuff that I need, but I have it. Right. I have the flexibility with my workforce. With my job, I have the healthcare. And so I think that if you look at members of Congress, um,
Hmm.
they have health care, they have childcare,
Yeah.
right? So it doesn't become a top priority for them because they're not dealing with the same problems. I have a friend who just got 6 months paternity leave. He just had a baby and he has 6 months paternity leave.
Mm.
He's a person who's of influence,
Hmm.
and yet the life he is living and the family life he is living is so different than the life of a blue collar worker. And I think that gulf, it's not that we have bad intentions. We have the best of intentions. We just don't know what their lives are like. And I think if we want democracy to work, we had better figure it out.
Absolutely. Again, the book is American Made: What Happens to People When Work Disappears. Farah Stockman, thank you very much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.